see? We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck you little credit card scam and jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, bought a little Louis XIII, Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head, my real top niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day peppering America overseas, pension for the workers, nigga please, embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement, I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut, foreclose a big close out the tenement, I twist words like a speech impediment, I hope you got good credit bitch, if not better get a new job with benefits, while I play golf with niggas and get cheddar with, new money buys brand new carrots, my old money bunch of great grandparents, you got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at ya, I own every gold mine in South Africa. Thanks, baby, you made me $1 billion. Plus, I own a building for each one of my children.
Welcome to this edition of Voice Rebellion Radio. I am your host, Chris J. Here at Voice Rebellion Radio, here at the one and only UCY.TV. Today, I am unaccompanied in the studio, just being me, as I talk about a couple of recent developments in the news. We had pretty much on Monday, the declaration by the United States government officially declaring Venezuela to be a dictatorship now. Meanwhile, they continue to support and deny the dictatorial government that is the regime in Riyadh. They pretty much deny that it's a dictatorship, even though it is a dictatorship. It is the only country really like it in the world when it comes to how backwards the type of human rights abuses, violations are committed by the Saudi government on the regular basis. In Venezuela, we are officially witnessing now, since the United States making its final encroachment possibly on Venezuela, as now they've pretty much put Venezuela in the same class according to the standards as like North Korea, Zimbabwe, countries that have that have been under the constant scrutiny of the United States and the West for years on end. And what happened in Venezuela is that Sunday they had their vote for the Constituent Assembly, which the Constituent Assembly is starting a new process where the people of Venezuela will have the ability to input on how they will rewrite the Constitution, and pretty much now they're going ahead on rewriting the Constitution. Unlike the United States, they do not do amendments in Venezuela. They'll just pretty much make a new one from scratch, I guess, even though they'll probably be, of course, taking parts from the other constitutions through the past, including the current constitution. However, the new constitution will be a new constitution of its own. And this was part of a kind of a plea by the government to the opposition in order to try to bring peace to the country, as they've now been in the face of crippling riots, major protests inside of Venezuela. Of course, a lot of it's hype. A lot of it's not as bad as the media's claimed, the situation in Venezuela, but however, there's been major problems, and it's being caused by different factors than what the media has told you that the situation in Venezuela is being caused by. Venezuela's government proposed this idea this summer, which ironically last summer the opposition proposed. However, now this time that the government proposed the Constituent Assembly idea, now the opposition was opposed to it. This is actually was one of the biggest victories of the Bolivarian government has ever faced, as they had many people voted for Constituent Assembly, as voted for Hugo Chavez in 2012. So about 8 million people voted for the Constituent Assembly. This is definitely a major showing by the people, that they do not want a fast and quick coup like I think the opposition wants, is that they want to take power covertly, and they want to take power overnight. They don't want to win. I don't even think they want to win by elections, because it seems like all the elections that they face, they lose, with the exception of the 2015 election for the parliament, which they took major gains in that. And pretty much by some tinkering, were able to take a supermajority of the National Assembly by 2016 when they were all sworn in. However, when they did take the supermajority, they did not win a supermajority according to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did say that 2 of their seats were invalid, that they had won. Originally, it was supposed to be just a majority, which I think about 64% of the National Assembly being taken by the MUD, but however, it ended up being over 2/3, which is a supermajority, and the supermajority is enough to call for, I think, a recall referendum on its own. Is that with that many people there, they could call the recall referendum, which hasn't happened yet. And they tried very hard to 2016 to call recall referendum, but however, they was not quite able to get enough public support for the recall referendum for Nicolas Maduro, who is still now the president of Venezuela and will be the president of Venezuela, it appears, until 2018, when the presidential elections happen. Earlier this year, we had reports. We've had all these different reports of these apocalyptic scenes practically in Venezuela. We've seen throughout the year a lot of these major riots and police and protesters clashing, and a lot of this is opposition and violence that's causing these disruptions in Venezuela. We've seen the opposition attack maternity wards, attack government buildings, set buses on fire, set people on fire. By all means, these people should be labeled, these people that commit these acts, right-wing terrorists. No different than the same kind of like right-wing terrorists that we've seen commit attacks in the United States. This is extremist ideology, and these people are committing terrible acts of violence to push their political agenda. And their political agenda being pretty much ushering in fascism, like what they had prior to the Chavez government. They had a fascist government. Andres Perez was a fascist who suppressed the left wing of the country via mass by use of violence. They killed like 3,000 protesters, possibly at the Carazaco, which was in 1989. So Venezuela it had a history of fascism. In fact, some of these people that are in the MUD party today are like leftovers from the 90s corrupt government, the 80s corrupt government. For example, Ramus Ayub is one of these people. And people say it's an exaggeration to call these people fascist, but I think by all definitions they were fascist, just the same definition that Pinochet was fascist, who is much more widely called a fascist and is more known for his fascist tendencies. People like Pinochet, the Argentinian military junta, is also more widely called fascist. The Venezuelan government of the 70s through 90s. On top of that, there was, the Brazilian government. I think is like also one of those governments is lesser known to being called fascist, but they're all part of the Operation Condor of the CIA backing these right-wing dictatorships in an effort to quell revolutionary activity across the continent, South America. Was as many as millions of victims were affected by Operation Condor. 60,000 in Chile alone were slain by the government of Chile under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. There was also dictatorships in Ecuador, I believe. There was dictatorship in Uruguay, where one of the recent presidents, Jose Mujica, was thrown in prison for 35 years, I believe, for rebel activity in the 1960s by the military. It was at one point with a military dictatorship in Uruguay. We also had in Bolivia, I believe it was at one point. Bolivia was a dictatorship at one point, and in fact they had a lot of interference from the man Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie was actually ex-Nazi who had at one point like a Nazi paramilitary that they was using to utilize to sway politics in the country. He helped with the CIA capture Che Guevara in 1980. Was helping the CIA topple a left-wing government in order to put in a dictatorship once again in Bolivia. And we've seen the history of this, is that there was attempts prior to 1998, the real resurgence with Chavez, the pink tide came out, the resurgence of left-wing activity in South America. We saw attempts and different governments that were short-lived that were left-wing throughout South America that they deposed throughout time. You had people like Jacobo Arbenz, who was deposed by the CIA in 1964. We've seen multiple governments like this that this happened to in similar fates, and the CIA determining the fates of these countries. And that's what they're trying to do with Venezuela today, and trying to revert it back to the days of the Operation Condor government. And these people are definitely agent provocateurs who are on the streets of Caracas protesting. I do not believe this to be a legitimate, total grassroots movement like is being claimed currently by the United States media. And, they kicked out CNN not too long ago, which was a smart move because CNN pushing their lies and propaganda to the people are been able to convince a lot of Venezuelans that things are happening, they're not actually happening. I think one of the biggest lies might be that the Venezuelan government is involved with the narco-trafficking trade. When ultimately, the people that are actually involved in the narco-trafficking trade are the United States government and United States allies. And this is long proved, this is the country, it's kind of, people actually believe the media of the country or of the government that has been long proved now to have been involved, and they practically have admitted to it, all the stuff about the 80s drug trade, being involved between this, the terrible alliance between the drug traffickers, the right-wing paramilitaries, and the United States government that existed in South America. And you had, like Manuel Noriega and so many other top drug kingpins that the United States government was involved with, including Pablo Escobar, who Pablo Escobar's son said that his father worked with the CIA. I think all the evidence is there and all the pieces are there that people should be able to realize that Pablo Escobar, all these different drug kingpins definitely worked with the United States government. Now it's no longer really a conspiracy theory. And, the same government is going to try to claim that Venezuela is involved with drug trafficking, when I believe that to be a lie. Is that Venezuela, there's definitely been some competence on the Venezuelan government, and that's probably that's the main thing that they're guilty of. And one of the mistakes that they made, and I think this is Ken Livingstone of the Labor Party said this, is that they didn't get rid of the oligarchs, is that Chavez didn't totally get rid of the oligarchs in Venezuela, now they're wreaking havoc. Unlike what Putin did, is that pretty much he totally dismantled the entire oligarch class in Russia, and now they haven't been able to wreak havoc, and things have been pretty stable, and it'll probably be the same thing for a successor. Which right now, actually, the odd thing is we're in August right now. The elections, I think, are in March for the next Russian president, and Vladimir Putin has actually not announced whether he's going to run again. He's said, however, in a major step forward, that he's now going to consider it. While he seems to have gave no indication of running again, there's a high possibility, I think, that Vladimir Putin might be hanging him up when it comes March or May, so that's when they're sworn in, and he might be about to pass over the torch to Shoigu, possibly, his Minister of Defense. There's multiple people that are probably candidates to be the next Russian president, but there's a high chance that Vladimir Putin, 1966 in next October, might not want to run again, and that he's retiring. Otherwise, by the time he is done with his fourth term total, this will be in 2024. By the time he's done with that, he'll be the age of 71. He'll be 71 by the time that his last term runs out in 2024. I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin wants to continue working to that point. But anyways, get a little bit off track of what I was talking about with Venezuela. Venezuela, we are seeing the effects, the oligarch class of Venezuela, the elite, are trying to push this chaos, and you have like supermarket chains that are hostile to the Maduro government, are hoarding food in order to try to disrupt the food process in the country. It's definitely happening. It's definitely not. I don't. The people are trying to say, and a lot of critics towards the Venezuelan regime, I try to say that it's economic mismanagement, and that alone has caused the problems in Venezuela. That'd be foolish to say that alone is causing the problems in Venezuela, not the sabotage, not the economic sanctions. So many external factors that are playing a part of this. Ultimately, the United States has been trying to overthrow their government. They tried to overthrow the government in 2002 in a coup attempt that failed. They tried to overthrow the government in 2015. They're trying again, it looks like, or they're about to try again. Maybe another coup attempt might be on the horizon. Of course, we also saw the heavily publicized coup attempts in 2002 that were really, it gained Chavez a lot of popularity, because prior to the coup attempt in 2002, Chavez actually only enjoyed about 30% May support or so. However, afterwards, he gained the hearts of a lot of people with the coup attempt, and ultimately the United States and Spain being mostly responsible for the coup attempt in Venezuela were unsuccessful, unlike when they did do the coup attempt against Allende and they put in Pinochet. They were trying to put in Carmona, which was an oil businessman who eventually fled and went in exile in Colombia. However, Carmona, I think, people like him, they should have been arrested. They shouldn't have been allowed to flee, and they shouldn't have really. I think that some of the people that were involved with the coup attempt were actually allowed, were not even forced to flee or spend any time in prison, and that was part of the problem, is that the oligarchs and the people that are troublesome people of Venezuela, people that are willing to collaborate with the banks, were not punished, and they pretty much just got another chance to do it again. Now, it's been 15 years, believe it or not, since the coup attempt. That was in 2002, and Venezuela's government seems to be on its fringes at this point, as it's right now. It seems that the 2018 election, if it was held today, and by what the polls show, we all know that polls are not very accurate. However, if the polls were accurate, and it would show the potentially a probably a pretty big win for the MUD. Probably that's whoever their candidate is winning. However, earlier this year we had Enrique Capriles, one of the main nemesis to the Venezuelan government, and ultimately, I would say, American poster boy. I think it was a questionable call by the government, but he was pretty much just banned from being in politics at this point. It's questionable because, of course, it looks like a suppression of democracy. However, this man he's part of an opposition that is not interested in democracy. Leopoldo Lopez, for example, people will say that he was unfairly jailed. I believe that he deserved jail, that his actions have resulted in much violence. And I think Capriles, to an extent, has also resulted in violence. I mean, he also had Capriles has said really ridiculous remarks. Like one time he said that Pinochet was a democratic man for the people. This is a man totally out of touch with the reality of the politics in his own continent. And Enrique Capriles, there's actually rumors that he wasn't even born in Venezuela. He was born in Colorado. Now, I don't know if I believe that, but however, I think that it does show. I mean, that a lot of the people in Venezuela don't trust him, so I don't think he would even be much of a worry to be voted in. And that's the thing with the opposition, is that they might have a decent amount of support for the movement as a whole against the Venezuelan government, but however, the amount of support for any particular person on the opposition seems to be pretty low. And that's why I think that the opposition may never win an election, because the Capriles-Radonsky might have been the most popular candidate, and now he can't run and he never could win an election. He faced 2 elections. In fact, he faced one against Maduro himself after Chavez died, and he narrowly lost in 2013. And it appears the same thing could happen if even if Capriles was to run against Maduro, it might have been another narrow loss in 2018, which the election is towards the end of next year. So we have a year plus of talking about this before, we don't know who might run against Nicolas Maduro or whoever runs in the place of the party, the PSUV. There's a good chance that Maduro might be stepping down because of the name kind of being tarnished by all this bad things that have happened during his presidency, not really to his fault, but by the United States government, Israeli government, the people that are influencing the politics of Venezuela from abroad. So that might be a reason why the PSUV might have to run somebody else. There's potential that they might run the more popular Diosdado Cabellos, who was originally seen as successor to Chavez. However, it was kind of by a surprise move in December 2012 that Chavez said that he would want Maduro to run if anything was to happen to him, which he would die 3 months later from the cancer that he was originally diagnosed in June of 2011. And Nicolas Maduro ran in April of 2013 in the special election because Chavez died in his first term. The vice president didn't automatically take over. They held a new general election, and Maduro won. So Chavez is forced. Technically, we're really in like Chavez's fourth term right now, or what it would have been Chavez's fourth term if he would have not died. Chavez who was elected in October of 2012, would be serving out the rest all the way up to 2018. However, Maduro is now carrying out the rest of that term, Chavez's fourth term. So, which practically was an entire term, and now by the next year, this will be the end of the term. So he has about 1 more year left of the term, and then they'll do another 6-year term, and then until 2024 will be the next term, unless the Constitution has changed with this whole Constituent Assembly process. They might go to shorter 4-year terms, perhaps. Who knows what they'll do? Perhaps they'll have term limits will be installed, which that's one thing about Venezuela is that they don't have term limits. Theoretically, Maduro or Chavez is still alive. He could have kept running 5, 6, 7, 8 terms if he wanted to, and I believe Chavez could have at least won one more election if he would have stayed alive. He could have won in 2018, I believe. Perhaps after that point, maybe they would want to see a new face there. But Maduro could theoretically run again. But I think for the sake of his own party, for the sake of the Bolivarian revolution as a whole, he ought to step down and let somebody else from his party run in his place. And I don't think that Maduro was the best candidate. He's not exactly as competent predecessor. And I mean, let's face it, this guy's literally, he's a bus driver he used to be a bus driver he rose up the ranks. However, I don't know if he's really presidential material to deal with the threats that Venezuela is dealing with on a daily basis nowadays in these troubling times. And Maduro might have been able to run Venezuela in some of its more peaceful times. However, right now it's in crisis mode. He's done an all right job for all the things that he's had to face. However, it's time that the people of it's time that the people in the PSUV try to find somebody new and start putting them out there to campaign for 2018. And I think that really it's anybody but Maduro. Any more popular people. I think Diosdado Cabellos would almost be a cinch because the opposition does not have. It's not in their favor. Because they don't really have somebody that they can, is really known that can run. I mean, I think that what they could put if she's out of prison, that's one of the big scandals that happened, and I've been talking about it on the news for a few days. That apparently Leopoldo Lopez, who was under house arrest, was taken from his home, and I think Lezema I think she might have been under house arrest. I think she was a former mayor of Caracas. I think she was taken from her home. Now, but I'm saying if she is able to run, perhaps there's a good chance that she could win. Leopoldo Lopez should under no circumstances be allowed to run anyways. He can't. He's under a 13-year prison sentence. There's no way that Leopoldo Lopez will be allowed to run in 2018. And, you do see like banners and stuff in Venezuela of Leopoldo. That's the thing. It's an odd dictatorship will allow banners of Leopoldo Lopez. You think that all of the marketing and all of the advertisements would be only allotted to the socialist government, but that's not the case in Venezuela. And that's why the labeling of it of a dictatorship is absurd. Also, labeling Venezuela as a country with an unfree press is absurd. They have 60% of the media is anti-government there, and is in favor of the opposition. A lot of the media is privately owned. A lot of the corporations there, unfortunately, still are privately owned, and I think that's what's caused a lot of the problems inside the country, is the oligarchs still having a lot of way over the economy. I don't think there's really a way to classify Venezuela as a dictatorship. And while they meanwhile continue relationship with Turkey, while Turkey, Erdogan was actually able to pass a referendum that increased his presidential powers. And they still, in fact, I think Trump actually congratulated him about it. And they still remain allied with Turkey. So this is a heavy hypocrisy that we hear there. They're going to call Turkey a dictator, or they're going to call Turkey an ally and Venezuela a dictatorship. Ultimately, one of the main reasons they are seeking to destabilize the Venezuelan government is the oil that is on Venezuela. That ultimately they have more oil than Saudi Arabia. And this angers the United States that they don't have a puppet no longer in place in Venezuela. Now, it's actually been that way almost 2 decades now. Next year will be the 20th anniversary of the Bolivarian Revolution. Chavez was elected, I think, October of '98 to power. So it's been 19 years that there's been since the Bolivarian Revolution. I think that's part of the problem with a lot of the younger people of Venezuela is that they don't remember a time before Chavez. So they don't remember the harder times of the 1980s and the early 1990s in Venezuela. So they can be easily influenced by the right wing of the country. They don't remember the struggles of the Carazaco in 1989, which you'd have to be pretty much a minimum of about 40 to really remember it happening. Now, that was 28 years ago, where about 3,000 protesters possibly might have been killed by the government of Andres Perez. They don't remember what led up to that, which is rising food prices. They don't remember they don't remember the repression of the government prior to that, and the incompetency of the government prior to Chavez. Is that really at this point, to remember a time prior to Chavez in any real extent, you have to be about 30 years old now, as it was 19 years ago when Chavez was elected. So let's say that you were, if you were just 11 years old at the time, now you're 30 years old. So the youngest, voters of the country between 18 and 30 don't really remember the time prior to Chavez. And, to remember some of those real struggles like they had in the 1980s, you might have to be 40 to 45 years old now to remember that. And also there's a sharp divide in the country economically. That, of course, a lot of the richer classes of the country want to support the opposition, while the poor of the country continues to support the Bolivarian Revolution, as a lot of them have directly benefited from the Bolivarian Revolution when it comes to education, medicine, and other things. However, the richer people of the country, when it comes to the richer, talk about, middle class or upper middle class, the upper class of the country that, from the beginning have been pretty much enemies of the Bolivarian Revolution. A lot of them, were the ones that were peddling propaganda very early on in the regime, saying things along the lines that Chavez was a dictator, was a communist, and these kind of propaganda and lies that eventually caused the coup in 2000, or led up to the coup in 2002. The people of Venezuela, they had the big marches around the time of the coup, and that ultimately set the stage for the military to make their move. But however, there was still a part of the military that was loyal to Chavez, which were able to repel the coup. The thing is that I think that also the difference is that, and I worry about that Maduro, not being a military man, might not be as in touch with the military as Chavez was, and I think that's part of the reason why the coup failed, is because Chavez was a military man, was more in touch with the military. Cabellos is a military man himself, and that's why I think it potentially would be more beneficial to the country if they would have a man like Cabellos rather than Maduro, who is really, I guess you could say, is more of a product of moving up the ranks, all the way from bus driver, now 30 years later, the president. But Trump has made a very tough stance against Venezuela, and he's met with people like Leopoldo Lopez's wife. He is definitely showing that he's not backing down on Venezuela, and I do fear that the United States may be concocting a plan, may using special forces, but potentially removing the government of Venezuela and flexing their muscle like they haven't done in decades when it comes to Latin America. And, we remember, some of the older listeners might remember, and I don't remember personally, but know the story somewhat about what happened at the invasion of Grenada. And the invasion of Grenada was pretty much this on a smaller scale, potentially, of what happened in Venezuela, is that there was a government that was aligned with the Cubans in Grenada, and then ultimately it was overthrown by hardliners of the party. They were trying to say that they were building a runway for the Soviets, so it was going to be a staging ground for the Soviets. And then ultimately the United States went in there and invaded in 1984. They actually did suffer some losses. In fact, the story about the Navy SEALs that apparently that they said they drowned out in the waters because their parachutes dragged them down. I think that was a lie. I think it was actually a story. What actually happened is that they got their heads cut off on the beaches, and there was also some Cuban construction workers were actually able to fight off the Americans pretty well. They did do some damage. However, the United States had a much more overwhelming force, and they were able to move on. However, some kind of like move like that, like what they did in Grenada, but up to a larger scale, might happen in Venezuela. And what Grenada kind of symbolized, which was the first time that the United States military had any kind of real victory since the Vietnam fiasco. Is that Vietnam we lost, and there was a lot of doubts about the future of the United States military. This was the first time that the United States showed that they're really that the military was back, that they were back to victory. And right now we actually have Trump pretty much admitting that we're losing Afghanistan. And I would say that at this point, I don't even know what ultimately is the goal in Afghanistan, by what ways he talks about. Because if it goes by the United States banking interest in taking opium and getting oil, then it's probably all mostly a victory, what they're actually involved in there. When it comes to terrorism, that was never really our goal, I don't think, because the United States funds and finances terrorism all throughout the Middle East. But if you're going by that, of course you're losing the war. However, it appears that, but this is what Trump said, that we're losing Afghanistan. So perhaps this is a way of like riding the ship of the United States military. This is going to be the next step, is that they're going to do some kind of invasion of Venezuela or some Latin American country in order to flex their muscle. But I think that at the same time, they're engaging and they're being cautious, because I think Bolivia has pledged their support in any kind of a United States invasion, that they would come in to help. They would not be alone if the United States was to come in to invade. and the United States is going to be really cautious of any kind of potential encroachment of Venezuela. And I think also potentially countries like Ecuador and other countries in I guess you could say, the Bolivarian Alliance would be willing to help Venezuela if they are ever threatened by the United States. However, also, there's like another example of thinking back when the United States used force on a Latin American country in a similar manner, but it was a different situation. It was more like cleaning up the evidence when it came to Noriega. When they arrested Noriega in 1989, and they did the invasion that pretty much was the end of the whole turbulent decade that was the 1980s. In December 1989, the United States deployed the military to Panama, and the Panamanian government was taken down. Noriega was taken to prison, and Noriega would end up spending 27 years in prison, and he died recently. I think he died about a couple months ago. He went to an American prison, then he was in a French prison, then he was in a Panamanian prison. But he was in a lot worse health recently. Like I think January, he slipped into a pretty bad state of health, and then he died a couple months ago. But the former narco collaborator of the United States, he was involved with the narco trafficking and connected to Pablo Escobar, most likely. So was the United States, is all connected in there. And I think that's what it was, is that this is a cleanup of all the dirty cocaine dealing and all this drug trafficking that the United States was involved in the 1980s, that they finally they wanted to clean the evidence, get rid of the tapes, and move on. So Panama, they went in there and took out Noriega, but it's a little bit different than that, because Noriega, that was that. I think this would be more closer like Grenada, and to show of force is that this would be a trophy for Donald Trump if he could take out Nicolas Maduro. And I could see that this or Cuba is going to be one of the countries that he may pick to do this if he wants to waffle on the idea of going straight into Iran. However, I believe there was reports, I think I saw somewhere that Trump said that we're going to be at war, or he hinted that we're going to be at war with Iran by October. Because he said, that's not, what he said was, I think that he said that Iran's going to break their deal by October, the nuclear deal that we signed with them a couple years ago. Which, that's pretty much saying war. Because I think it's pretty much a condition, is that if they break the nuclear deal, we're pretty much going to war, and that's pretty much what's been Trump's stance. And he believes that the nuclear deal is a total failure. He believes that this is us actually handing Iran $150 billion a year, and he believes us to be bowing down to Iran. He calls it the worst deal in the history of deals. Trump also, though he's like backed out of it at times, like for example, when facing with Ted Cruz wanted the total elimination of the deal, while Trump seemed to be more of a revision of the deal. Donald Trump, of course, an enigma figuring out what his actual stance is, but to remember that when he came to AIPAC, he bowed down and actually seemed non-Trump-like in the speech. Is that usually he's known for doing his speeches like a rally, no matter what the setting practically. Donald Trump is never really that formal, but however, the AIPAC himself looked presidential, and presidential as in swearing pretty much the vow to protect Israel at the cost of American lives, and that's what he did at AIPAC. And it's disgusting, as the talk pretty much going almost along the lines of no option off the table. Even with what he said at AIPAC, we all heard it, as saying that we're no longer going to treat Israel as second-class citizens, which is a very alarming thing to say when as much as America's already kissed their ass in previous years with Obama, who actually only, when it came to a vote in favor of Israel, I think that's what it was, he only abstained one time ever, unlike other presidents have done it more times than him. In fact, I think Reagan did it 10 times. However, it doesn't really signal being in favor or against Israel, the abstaining these votes. when it comes to American presidents, we know where they stand. However, Trump tried to say that Obama was anti-Israel or was not the best friend of Israel, and that Trump was going to right the ship with that. However, it's all either. Obama, Trump, Romney, McCain, they're all on the same team. And, talk about McCain, when it comes to Syria, is that McCain, who met with ISIS, and we've seen that picture about 4 years ago with him meeting with Baghdadi, is that McCain now is, he's still in the Senate, and now this might be some of the last times we ever see McCain, as right now he's sick with brain cancer. This might be one of the last things, however, he might push is for the war in Syria against Bashar al-Assad. And he's been a neocon, a war hawk for his entire career. He got to the Congress, I think, in the 1980s. He's been there for like 30 years, and he's been one of the most recognizable war hawk faces that we can think of when we think of the war we think of the wars that have been pushed by politicians. Is that McCain has been notorious for pushing unnecessary wars, and he's been also, when it comes to Russia, he's pretty much labeled Vladimir Putin a bully, a killer, many other things. I'm surprised they let this guy in Russia one time. But John McCain is the mainstream neocon as it gets. And, he's definitely, people, and that's the thing that I've noticed from this whole, presidential cycle, is that 2016, is everybody was saying, I missed the days when our party was insane or whatever. But really, when it comes to the Republican Party, is that they were insane with McCain, the war hawk neocon that he was. Romney was pretty much talking about pushing towards world war with Russia. We had the Bush years, and the Democrats, the same thing, is that we had people like Kerry, that you see as an ultimate war hawk, a neocon, who became the Secretary of State and was almost brought us to the point of war in Syria in Barack Obama's second term. He was a part of that. And, we've had these other candidates as well that, you can't think of really a time when there was actually a real, a candidate that actually, last time we actually had a Democratic that actually was opposed to the status quo with JFK, and he became the president. We all know what happened to that. A Republican, now you might have to think back all the way to the years of Taft, and that's really where it changed, 1913, when the Federal Reserve was enacted, which also, I believe, was the same year the FBI was enacted. The ADL was enacted, which people say, oh, well, you're against the ADL, you must be anti-Semitic. But it's not really a organization that protects hate speech against Jews. It's an organization to, in the guise of that, to censor people, say that they're anti-Semitic, because I've seen them on many things that are not anti-Semitic really at all, called anti-Semitism. That you say something about Israel, they'll act like you called for the second Holocaust. It's absurd how the ADL acts and overreacts to normal statements, and because it's a censoring agency. And when they came about in 1913, along with the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve were at the helm of it was Rothschilds, and it just happens that these people are predominantly Jewish that are at the helm of these banking organizations. So it's very convenient, in the guise of protecting all Jews, you make this organization that, if you make criticisms about who runs the Federal Reserve, now, no, it's not because you're mad about their actions, it's because you don't like Jews altogether, is what they'll say. The ADL, the FBI, all these organizations came about in 1913, which actually I just learned about recently. This is actually news to me. There was a very powerful speech actually I watched. And I don't really, I haven't paid too much attention. My years in researching and being involved in the truth movement. Now it's been almost, it's been 4 years or so since I've really been involved online in the truth movement. But I really haven't paid too much attention to Louis Farrakhan, who had a really powerful speech about the Rothschilds, and it was a powerful speech. about it. It was about 18, 19 minutes. And, you know, I admit I don't have the longest attention span with stuff on the internet. People send me stuff. People, a lot of times they're hours long, and I never really get to watching it. However, this, I took the time to watch this, listen to this whole thing, 20 minutes of him talking about the Federal Reserve. And, you know, he was talking about also about Taft. You know, I don't know how true it was, but he claimed that in 1912, to make sure that Taft wouldn't win again, they gave the challenge by Teddy Roosevelt, and that they financed Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And because instead of having Teddy Roosevelt be the one that pushes the Federal Reserve Act, they wanted Woodrow Wilson to push the Federal Reserve Act, because it would look better coming out of a Democrat. And Woodrow Wilson, you think about all the terrible things that happened during his presidency. We had the Federal Reserve, we had World War I, Prohibition, all in his presidency. And even though Prohibition, I'll say, is a terrible thing, because it ultimately led to the rise of gangsters and people making tons of money off of bootlegging alcohol. And ultimately, the whole premise of it, the whole premise of Prohibition, is it's immoral. That the government, it seems that if the government banned something like that, when it banned alcohol, it led to people doing riskier alternatives. It led to people drinking bathtub gin, and also the government went to very extreme lengths to try to enforce prohibition. There was a point where they even poisoned alcohol, and I think got a lot of people sick in order to try to discourage people from drinking. So even that, I'm going to say, was a terrible thing. But getting us into World War I, what really we could say was maybe our first totally unnecessary war. We had no point in being that war, but through the lie of, and I would say it's almost like the equivalent of the lie of the Russia hacked the election. It's the equivalent of that lie was the lie of the Zimmerman telegram that supposedly Germany was trying to egg on Mexico to invade us, and ultimately that's what pushed us into war. And the Lusitania, which it was the 9/11 of its time, and it was a 9/11 type event because of the false flag nature of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger ship that was crossing the Atlantic. The Germans gave warning to the people that were about to board that boat that they would sink that ship because, unlike what the American government was claiming, that there were just small arms pistols on the ship, which would be one thing, they had bombs on the ship. They had arms on the ship, and this is the way that they were bringing weapons across, and that the United States government was supporting the European allies such as the UK. Also, the British Navy had breaking through the German coding system. They knew the positions of the submarines across the Atlantic. They could have saved the lives of those people on board if they would have told the Americans that where the German submarine positions were, but they allowed it to happen. And also, because of those bombs, it also helped that ship sink a lot quicker. And that's why that ship took about a minute to sink, because they got hit by the torpedo and the bombs went off and the thing went straight down. And this happened in 1915, and this would be one of the major things that would lead America toward their involvement in the war. The Germans had warned publicly of this happening. They were trying to tell that they didn't want this to happen, but it happened. And the German government got all the blame. The Kaiser, would later, they would depict Germany as like this beast, and the Kaiser as being this, monstrous creature and stuff like that. And we would get into World War I, and we would be there only about a year before the armistice, and then the notorious Treaty of Versailles was passed in 1919. And then after that, through from 1920 to 1923, the terrible era of inflation happened in Germany, and they went from, at one point, the Reichsmark being worth would be 4.3 of those to $1. By the end of that period, it was 4.3 trillion to $1. Their money had inflated so much that they're using it for firewood, they were using it for decoration. Their money was worthless at this point, practically. A lot of people ended up going back to pretty much the times of the Stone Age. And ultimately, really the period after the Kaiser fell in 1918, in the November of 1918, ever since that point, Germany's never totally recovered. Is that you had the Weimar Republic years, the weak years of Germany, falling off the world stage and being a joke practically, and inflation and everything. Then they Nazi Germany and the horrors that they experienced under that. Then the country being split in two and being controlled by one side by a Stalin-esque government, East Germany, and an American puppet regime on the other side in West Germany. And nowadays, the country being ran by the joke of Angela Merkel. There's been no real great era of Germany ever since the Kaiser fell, almost a century ago. So that was a massive, that was pretty much the fall of Germany. Also happened in part by the fall of America, with America being corrupted and taken over by corporate, large banker interests, and now controlling the military. They helped bring down Germany, in my opinion. I think the Kaiser was not one of them, very likely, and he did make a mistake. One of his major mistakes the Kaiser did was help the Bolsheviks to take out the Russian government in order to try to win the war against Russia, which later the Kaiser did show regret, it appears. However, I think the Kaiser might have been freed the bankers. In the 1912s, a big election, it actually was split four ways. And there was also a man that probably would have opposed the Federal Reserve if he would have won, but he only got 8% of the vote, which was Eugene Debs of the Socialist Party, who talked about, one of his quotes is that he didn't want to rise through the ranks, he wanted to rise with the ranks, that he wanted to bring his common people up with him. Eugene Debs was kind of a statement of a lot of people in the country at that time, was that we had a lot of people of the left, a lot of socialists in the country, as we had like a little bit of a socialist movement, which later would kind of get phased out when we had the first Red Scare in the 1920s. But Teddy Roosevelt, he got like 26% of the vote, which ultimately, if his vote would have went to the other side, then it might, and if it wouldn't have been split by against Taft, then we might have not seen Woodrow Wilson's election. And Taft, he opposed a congressional amendment, I think it was, in order to, I think it was a congressional bill in order to pretty much install the Federal Reserve. So because he opposed it, they wanted to put their guy in, Woodrow Wilson, and that's why they barely dislike Taft. And it might be why Taft is kind of like seen as just like the only thing that he's rarely even mentioned in history books, despite him being kind of a semi-recent president. We're not talking about one of those 1830s, 1840s presidents that didn't really do anything. It was really the era of the Congress doing everything. However, Taft was past the turn of the century, but he's rarely mentioned in the textbooks. And the only thing that pretty much we know him in the textbooks for as Americans is being very heavily overweight. However, he seemed to have opposed the Federal Reserve, and being the last real president before that happened, I think that might be why Taft is kind of shunned from the textbooks. And Teddy Roosevelt, if it's true that the bankers backed Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, maybe that's perhaps why he gets this badass kind of like a legend stance in our textbook, is that practically Teddy Roosevelt is seen as this guy that survived a shooting attempt in 1912. He's seen as this guy that was just an all-out, almost like a Vladimir Putin of his time when it comes to this outdoorsy, tough leader, is how it's shown in our textbooks. However, he might have not been the strong, independent man that he was painted out in the textbooks as being. And I believe he opposed, I think he might have opposed the Glass-Steagall Act, which, despite the person who passed it, I think was a pretty good bill to try to break up monopolistic power, which was McKinley, who was ultimately assassinated himself in 1901. However, he was by no means a great president. I mean, he was responsible in part for the Filipino genocide that the Americans would commit during the Spanish-American War. He got us into the Spanish-American War, which was a war that, I'm going to say, at least we were largely had no part in. I'm not going to say we had totally no part in just because of the fact that its proximity to the United States, and there was probably a legitimate fear considering that we were still in the wake of European monarchies at the time that um, that we could fear a Spanish invasion. And I think that's why I'm not. And they were right there at Cuba, and they could easily come up, but it was not quite to the point of being a existential threat that the Spanish were not dealt with in Cuba and Puerto Rico.
My name is S.